Cassus looked out across the ether at the slowly tumbling husks that had once been proud Desvian warships. The only one he was familiar with was the biggest of the defensive fleet, the HMS Goliath. How small it was compared to the Retribution. He hoped Captain Lanius was still alive, but he hadn't been told anything. It was strange to watch the battle unfold from the bridge of an enemy ship fighting his countrymen. The mechanical systems they had far surpassed anything he'd seen the various technician guilds use. He was worried about how much power their machines had, however. From what he'd gathered, the humans had never faced a machine rebellion, but that didn't mean such a thing couldn't happen. They always spoke to that glowing red eye he saw in various rooms. It creeped him out a bit, to trust a machine with so much. As far as he was aware, only the technocracy had managed to form a peaceful union with machines before the humans arrived, and their territory was small and weak, so he didn't know much about them. Cassus had been praying to the Paragons regularly that they might guide him through these trying times, but so far they'd been quiet. His life was complicated now. He'd always pictured being a prisoner of war as a regretful but noble ideal. To be behind enemy lines, most likely in Phexian territory, waiting out the war until a prisoner trade while he wrote or studied. Instead, he was sleeping in the same room, and often same bed as the enemy commander, and dragged around to insane festivals of lights and sounds he'd never imagined. What had they called it? A dance club. Perhaps the word club was an allusion to being beat over the head with lights and sounds. And Loretta had not been helpful. The young noble seemed to relish the human way of life. After that first night, she'd been clay in Andromeda's hands. The drugs Cassus stayed away from were like candy to her. He'd always figured that landed nobles studied and prepared for a life of ruling and decision-making when they were young, but instead it seemed they just partied until midlife when they took power from their parents. The more time he spent with her, the lower his opinion of the ruling class of his own nation. Surely the king and queen were different. One thing was for sure, however, noble, commoner, or madwoman Andromeda defied all his attempts at classification. He'd first thought her victory over him was merely a matter of surprise and being outnumbered. But as he'd witnessed in the recent battle, she was a very shrewd and intelligent military commander. He still wasn't sure how her madness and intelligence worked together like they did. For example, she'd told the planetary governor she wasn't going to give him 24 hours to prepare like he requested, but then told her officers that she'd agreed to it, but was going to attack anyway while the defenders were unprepared. Perhaps he'd ask her? "Captain Devoros!" Cassus jumped a little at that, as he worried that somehow the woman had read his thoughts, but as he looked over, she was simply walking up to him, flanked by Junko. "So what did you think?" "About what?" he asked and arched a brow. "The battle, of course," she pressed with a chuckle. "It was very interesting. Then you charged a force with superior numbers when they tried to reposition to minimize their chances of being hit by that very weapon. Interesting tactic. It obviously worked well. Though I wonder how things would have gone if you'd given them time to prepare like they requested." Before he continued, Andromeda began laughing. "Were they seriously expecting me to abide by that? You can't seriously mean that when you wage wars, your enemy will actually give you time to assemble your forces." Cassus shifted a little as she laughed, feeling slightly embarrassed for some reason. "Ah, yes we do. It's part of the agreed-upon rules of conflict that all civilized nations have signed. The Comexius were the only ones who didn't abide by them. And now you," he nodded slowly at Andromeda. "Ah, but we aren't a nation yet, are we? And we haven't signed those rules either," Andromeda said with a smirk that made Cassus frown. "It's still in poor taste. Though may I ask why you told the governor your intentions, but then told your officers that you had agreed and were going to betray your word?" When he asked that, she smiled wide in that way that always made him feel uncomfortably like she was about to kill him and eat him, or get that damn whip out again. "Because it's the best of both worlds. I don't lie to the governor, so I'm not betraying my word. I know he likely can't do much with the information in the hour or two he had between opening communication and my attack, and my officers think they've got the element of surprise which makes them strike harder. War is as much about psychology as anything else. I don't know about your kind, but humans often fight harder when they're told they have an advantage even if it isn't true, at least in short engagements." Cassus blinked a little, surprised by her explanation. "So you lied to your officers?" Andromeda shrugged. "I changed the truth a bit. It wasn't an important lie. Look how well we crushed your defense fleet. Not my defense fleet, Cassus corrected. The Desvian defense fleet protecting this planet. If it were my defense fleet, I would have handled things differently. You were at your most vulnerable when landing your forces, so I would have waited until the retribution was positioning itself above the planet and then attacked with everything. With the ship's belly to the planet, it would have been harder to get your broadside or forward cannon aimed properly, and we could have closed the distance before too many ships were lost. That, or I would have urged the governor to just hand over the freighters full of supplies you wanted and not fought at all. Andromeda seemed surprised and slowly nodded. Not fighting is an option for you? Of course it is. Do you think I got to be captain by senselessly fighting every battle that didn't need to be fought? Cassus stood up straight then, feeling a bit of pride return. Only when all other options have failed should a good captain resort to cannon and battle. How fortunate you must be then to have such options. Cassus frowned as he tried to make sense of what Andromeda was saying, though she seemed to get that. Perhaps it's different in this sector, but at times among humans, violence needs to be the first answer, as all the others simply give your enemy time to prepare, and they will happily bide their time stringing along thoughts of diplomacy and peace so they can strike when it is best for them and not for you. Cassus didn't like the sound of that one bit. How did humans wage wars then? He was about to ask, but the continued. Humans used to fight like you. Rules, restrictions, noble ideals, romantic notions about battle. But we changed. That time period was really just a fluke, you see. Small skirmishes to decide national disputes, move borders back and forth a bit. It worked until the nations that agreed to this started fighting nations that knew they couldn't win a stand-up fight, and yet had no intention of surrendering or giving up. It's got a few different names depending on your perspective. Andromeda smiled then as she turned from Cassus, looking out at the remains of the Desvian ships. If you're the small side, you call it asymmetric warfare and infrastructure sabotage. If you're the big nation, who would win the stand-up fight, you call it terrorism. Throughout human history, wars of that type have been fought over and over. Historians argue who was right and who was wrong, but honestly, I don't think it matters. There's a human saying, war doesn't determine who's right, only who's left. Cassus shivered a little as she said that. He was even more worried about how humans went to war with a saying like that. Pretty much all wars he'd been involved in were over specific interests or matters and came to clear conclusions. Only who's left? He asked. Oh, indeed. You see, you seem to call all your conflicts wars, but humans decided that wars should be more... Andromeda tapped her chin, looking for the right word, it seemed. Epic. So for most small conflicts, we have other names. Police action, border skirmish, things like that. When humans actually truly go to war, it's with the intent of completely and utterly killing and conquering the other nation. That isn't to say either side achieves this goal, but that's the intent. Nuclear weapons, biological warfare. Hell, we've scorched planets clean of life and left behind barren rocks in the name of securing peace. You can't be serious, Cassus gasped. But the civilians aren't soldiers. Who builds the machines of war? Who mines the minerals needed for industry? Who farms the food that feeds the troops? Who cares for the wounded? Andromeda looked over at Cassus with a grin that made his blood run cold and the hair stand up on the back of his neck. There's another saying humans have, all's fair in war. Morals, ethics. Those are tools for philosophers, historians, and other scholars to try and decide who was right and who was wrong. But when you're fighting, there are times when you'll have to decide what's more important. Losing with some subjective and cultural perspective of honor, or doing anything and everything necessary to win, at all costs. You can't tell me that's subjective, Cassus protested. Killing civilians, waging unrestricted war at any costs? How can you tell me that isn't inherently wrong? Because there is no such thing as inherently when we're talking about concepts like this. Cassus, in your time with me so far, does it seem like I give a shit about how Desvians view me? Does it seem like I even care how my own people view me? No, it doesn't seem like you do. It doesn't seem like I do because I don't, Andromeda chuckled. The insects you fought before, do you think they told themselves what they were doing was wrong and dishonorable? And whatever else, evil, I suppose. Or do you think that they thought what they were doing was simply how it should be done? Cassis was quiet, and she took his silence for an answer. Morality and ethics is subjective. There was a nation of humans 1,000 years ago or something, the Aztecs. They committed human sacrifice in the name of their gods. They very purposefully didn't fully conquer enemy tribes, so they could always raid their settlements for fresh tributes to ritualistically slaughter to appease their gods. They didn't think what they were doing was wrong or evil or any of that. They'd cut people open and rip their still beating hearts out of their chests, because that way they could make sure the world kept spinning and ensure their crops would grow so their people wouldn't starve to death. Cassis didn't realize his mouth was hanging open until he tried to say something and had to sputter for a moment until he regained control over his muscles properly. What? That's madness! You can't use some insane religion to defend your position on the subjective nature of honor or wrongness. He was having trouble defending his views. He wasn't a scholar who was used to these sorts of debates. I mean, you and I know that their gods didn't really keep the world spinning, and sacrificing captives didn't make their crops grow. But just as we know that now, they were 100% confident in what they knew then, that this is indeed how you get the sun to rise and the crops to grow. Morality is subjective. It changes. A murder in one culture could be an honorable duel in another. A ruler might be considered progressive and just in their own age, only to be considered backwards and barbaric ages after their death. There are, of course, plenty of humans who don't think things are subjective. They believe in right and wrong, black and white, but I often find it's those people who commit some of the worst atrocities. Andromeda snorted as if the idea were funny, but Cassis didn't share in her humor. Is this more of your talks about justification? He asked. Me? I'm trying to explain to you so you better understand humans, although perhaps I'm just opening your mind to people in general. How often have you had your thoughts challenged? The only way to truly know what you believe is to have someone else challenge your perception. Andromeda nodded slowly. To be honest, I admire Desvians a great deal. Your ships, for example. What about them? Cassis asked, a little unsure of the new direction of the conversation. All those details to the hulls, the obvious love and care put into the sculptures and figureheads. You create warships as if they were art pieces, though it bodes ill for your chances against a human military. Cassis frowned. And why is that? How many hours does that add to the construction of each ship? My father told me that battles are decided by commanders, tactics, and strategy, but most often wars are decided by logistics. This ship, my ship, is perhaps the pinnacle of human achievement. You think a warship is the pinnacle of your species' achievement? Cassis asked, surprised. I do, she said with a nod. Hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions, all had to work together for it to be built. The materials were mined, processed, and refined. Then they were shaped, bent, and formed. After that, hundreds of thousands of the finest shipbuilders, electricians, and other craftsmen took the materials and assembled them. They followed a set of plans made by a team of some of the best engineers and scientists who have ever lived. This ship is powered by not one but 3 of the largest and most powerful reactors humanity has ever built. One of them is used to power the largest plasma cannon ever built. All of this, she waved at the ship around her, is only here because of the hundreds of millions who worked to make it a reality, directly or indirectly. Andromeda took a slow, deep breath and nodded. And we built it to kill other humans. Cassis blinked and looked at her for a moment before shaking his head and speaking up. You can't seriously believe that your whole race exists just to kill each other. Andromeda glanced back with a slight frown. Oh, I suppose that sounded a bit dire. Cassis nodded and continued. What about art? Music? I might not care for a great deal of the sounds your musicians string together in what's apparently a song, but I will certainly admit that your ability to make different music far exceeds anything I've ever encountered. And those paintings, and even the few statues I've seen. Humans clearly have skilled artisans. Andromeda nodded. Yes, we do. But for me, nothing can compare with the beauty of our war machines, especially the retribution. Human achievement in science and medicine and other peaceful fields are of course magnificent, but those don't have the same power of unification. Unification? Cassis arched his brow as he tried to understand. Yes. You see, we all have different tastes in music and art and food and everything like that. But But we will never come together more completely than when we go to war. I mentioned the hundreds of millions that it took to build this ship, all working together. She smiled wide and stared off at nothing. It's awe-inspiring to me to think how so many totally different people could come together for this purpose. It's not unique to humans, though, Cassis protested. My people build ships of war and other such devices. Well, sure, but you're a unified species. That hardly seems as impressive since you were already unified in worshipping a ruler whose only qualification is that his parents fucked. When Andromeda said that, Cassis blinked and leaned back a bit. But enough about all this. You barely told me what you thought about the battle itself and the raid. You had more insight into how humans fight now. Any comments? Cassis had to change mental tracks as Andromeda suddenly changed the topic on him. I was quite interested in how your officers spoke. Especially the ground forces. They almost sounded bored. Very mechanical most of the time. At least the tone. I've learned a bit of English so far, and they kept using strange words I didn't understand. Yes. Some time ago we discovered that if communication officers learn and adhere to a strict guideline of word use and key phrases, they were more concise while under fire. It's English but very rigid, so it kind of makes them pause and restructure their words in their head. Very useful for reducing the chaos of battle. Cassis nodded. Something else I wanted to ask. How do you keep your forces that well organized when they're pirates? You mentioned looting and pillaging rather regularly when talking to your men in those speeches, but from the reports, I could see your forces maintained better discipline than several organized armies I've encountered, even some of our own. Most of my dedicated ground forces are from the Confederate military. They're well experienced and well-disciplined through their experience. As for the new recruits, I have designated officers who keep them in check. As I also mention in my speeches, if you start looting without permission, you get shot. Then there's a little trick. You see, I have specific, very well-trained troops who do the actual majority of the looting. They're trained for it, how to evaluate and acquire on the go. So the cannon fodder sees that some people are looting and know they'll get a cut but have to wait their turn. And once the battle is actually won, they're allowed some time to do so. How do you keep them all sane? Andromeda laughed at that. Who says we are sane? But I think you're referring to the hardships of battle in general. Well, the weak were weeded out years ago. Don't forget it's been years since we became pirates. Those who are left relish combat more than fear it. They think of the rewards instead of the killing. I also have a large number of psychologists on staff over on the colony ship, with free counseling for any soldier who requests it. And the new recruits are also exposed to battle drugs, a mixture of stimulants and other narcotics that make them energetic and euphoric in battle. They are also all volunteers. They were given some sort of choice, and those who fight for me chose to do so. Well, what about your officers? Well, two things. There's a whole nother command center for the ground forces overseen by General Granger. 2, as I mentioned, my dedicated ground forces are almost entirely Confederate military. That means they survived the war and every year since then. Any bad Confederate officer was dead, captured, or run off by the end of the war, so I'm left with only the best. Or, at least the most likely to survive. Cassis nodded slowly at that. It made sense that decades of constant fighting would provide the best soldiers and officers. Perhaps these humans simply had more endurance for such things. Overall, he was left slightly disturbed by the possibilities for the future of the sector's interactions with humans in general. But he had to remind himself Andromeda only had 3 warships and less than 1 million men. The kingdom was comprised of dozens of fleets, each with dozens of warships and billions of citizens. Yet, for all he'd seen Andromeda do, he was more worried about the conglomerate that followed, and he wasn't sure why. "Sir, I just got word," Junko said, which made Cassis look over at her, almost having forgotten her presence. They spoke a bit more quickly than he could catch with his now limited English. Something about some new fleet? Some world had been found? He couldn't catch everything. But thankfully, when they were done talking, Junko turned to the light table they had and brought up a map of the sector. Andromeda waved him over then. "We just got word from the colony fleet. They've just been contacted by other settlers. Apparently, the Congos found one of the hidden refugee worlds the Confederate colonists were using, so now we might have another colony fleet join us." "Even more recruits?" he asked, but Andromeda shook her head. "No, these aren't suitable for my fleet. These are the folks who turned down my offer last time. I'll help them out. but they're highly unlikely to have any military assets. Even so, I swore I'd protect all Confederates no matter what, so it's my burden to deal with. She was looking at the map of the sector before pointing to a planet beyond the Desvian border. What's this place like? Cassis took a closer look at the planet before shrugging. I couldn't tell you. Abandoned centuries ago in the Chimexius War. It wasn't one of our colonies. The area has limited piracy. It's not on a favorable trade route, so I suspect just vagabonds and criminals and the like. Well, it looks perfect. It's between us and the maze here, she said as she pointed out the locations on the map. So we can set it up as a staging area for other colonists to flee to before we actually settle the maze. We can leave the majority of the colony fleet behind as well if need be. Junko start giving them orders to head there. We should beat them to the system. Oh, and bring me our best courier. I want to get word to a certain mercenary. Wait. You're about to dedicate resources to refugees and colonists who have no intention of joining your fleet or helping you, Cassis asked, surprised by the information. Of course. I told you my objective, Captain Deveros. I will make a home for my people and all who don't wish to live under the iron grip of the conglomerate. That is my only goal. Besides, they're used to living on the run at this point. I shouldn't miss out on very many resources, and perhaps they can set up some temporary factories on this planet to build me things. She shrugged. We'll negotiate once they're safely on planet. Sir, we've just got word from Captain Stahl. The raid on the university is beginning, Junko said then. Excellent. I'm going to go talk with General Granger and see how things went on the surface. Let me know if we get any updates from Stahl. Andromeda turned, then walking away, as Cassis was left with Junko on the bridge. You know she's pretty one-sided when discussing the nicer sides of humanity, right? Junko mentioned, which made Cassis chuckle softly. Yeah, I got that impression. He nodded slowly as he watched the woman walk away flanked by her guards. You just have to understand she was raised to be a commander. Her whole life revolved around war and tactics and strategy. So of course that's what she thinks makes us great. She doesn't even do herself credit. On the colony ship, there's food enough to go around, medical care, entertainment, art, culture. It wasn't just soldiers who followed her after the fall of the Confederacy, and she didn't even touch on how good we are at taking military tech and turning it into something civilians can use. Trust me, we aren't all as warlike as Andromeda and her pirates. Cassis thought it over for a moment and looked Junko in the eyes. Will the conglomerate come for us? Will they try to impose their will on this sector like they did the rest of the human nations? Junko broke his gaze as she looked away, thinking it over for a moment before she shrugged. I don't know. That fleet that attacked the colony ship had diplomats on board. Maybe they want to play nice. Maybe they'll want to take over. They weren't satisfied with controlling the majority of human territory. It's possible they won't be satisfied with what they have now either. Cassis looked ahead as the grinning Andromeda left the bridge. Then there's a chance she might be the only hope my people have of retaining their freedom. And that thought scares me. Yeah, well, that phrase she told you earlier? All's fair in war? The actual saying is all is fair in love and war. And despite what it may seem like at times, Andromeda has a lot of love in her. For her officers, for her crew, for her ideals. That love blinds her sometimes, but if you needed her help to stay free of the Congos, well, she'd be there to help. So then why is she driving her fleet into the heart of the sector? He asked as he glanced over. Not to mention negotiate with the Chimexius. Because she found out what she needs to take control of the maze. Cassis frowned after Junko said that. It took him a moment to realize what she meant. The artifacts? No, there is no way she'll be able to get them all. The Germo told her about some sort of meeting that assembles all the artifact holders on that peace planet. Cassis gasped as she mentioned that. And she's got the Crown Prince captive. Gather them all up in one place and then raid them all at once. But that would involve attacking the Palace of Peace. No one has... Cassis stopped then as he looked out the viewports at the planet before them. Right, she doesn't care. So she gathers allies and she can bribe the Germo for assistance. He nodded as he understood. She started working on that plan since Yaniv told her about the maze and the artifacts. Cassis frowned as he looked over. Who's Yaniv? Junko arched her brows at that, surprised by the question for some reason. That Germo trader who you met the other day. He seemed to know you personally. Now it was Cassis's turn to make a face as he was confused. Thressus? His name is Thressus, not... What did you call him? Yaniv. It is! Junko and Cassis stared at one another as he could tell they were both confused. Do most Germo you know have Desvian names? Well, yes. Cassis nodded and then paused. Those aren't their real names. It would appear not. Junko laughed softly and nodded. Our chief negotiator claimed as much. I just thought he was being silly. I guess not. Why would they do that? Cassis asked. What's the point? Maybe they think having familiar names will make you consider them more friendly and close, Junko ventured before shrugging. Tell me, Cassis suddenly realized something. Did he tell you where my flotilla was? Before you came out of the nebula and attacked. Junko laughed at that. He warned us a very large important fleet was in orbit around some planet, so we should take a path down closer to the edge of the nebula. When she said that, Cassis slowly sighed out and shook his head. The nebula the prince wanted to see, so I decided to pick a stretch of space I figured would be empty. He shook his head then as he realized that their meeting was purely chance. How different would his life be now if he had chosen a different course? Speaking of that, actually, how long can the prince stay in that vault thing? When Junko asked that, Cassis frowned and tried to think before shrugging. Another few days. Another few weeks? I honestly don't know. He sighed then and shook his head. Honestly, all this talk has been draining a bit. Well, we can head back to Andromeda's quarters, or we could go see how the raid on that library is going. This will be the first use of some newly trained Desvian commandos. Do you want to see how well they do? As Junko suggested that Cassis frowned. Desvian commandos. It was a strange human word. Commandos. Yet, he was a little curious. Some of the crew going over to join the humans, fine. There were plenty of degenerates who had been forced into the Navy due to conscription. But he couldn't picture any Desvian who had the discipline to become a professional soldier who also wanted to fight for the humans. Perhaps that would be interesting, he admitted then. This might be the first indicator as to how well our species will get along. In the greater scheme of things, I mean, for your kind to take orders from human officers, to see how well they perform in comparison. She shrugged. Maybe if things go well, you can convince Andromeda to help you liberate your people. Liberate? Cassis eyed her with confusion. Liberate us from who? Your king. Wouldn't you rather have a government where you can decide who rules you? That other girl Andromeda picked. Loretta? She doesn't seem like the kind of person who should be given the power to decide the life and death of her subjects, does she? She's just one girl, and I'm sure most of the day-to-day operations would be handled by her advisors. Cassis tried to dismiss the idea, but he'd been thinking about it earlier, so it was harder for him to do so. Well, then shouldn't they have every right to be actually in charge? And not put up with some spoiled little child who doesn't know how to rule? Why believe in a system where your leaders are chosen by their birth instead of their abilities? You mentioned before your grandmother was a commoner and that was a hidden secret in your family. Wouldn't you prefer to marry who you like and not who you must? Cassis finally held up his hands. Stop. Please. I've had too much talk of these sorts of things right now. Can we just, please, stop? Junko frowned at that. Sorry. I suppose we're pushing you kind of hard. It's just... Well, Andromeda likes you, so she wants you to see things her way, and I also like you, so I'm guilty of it too. Cassis snorted a little. As much as you two are different, it's clear you have each influenced the other. But political discussion and ideology aside, can we go watch the raid? I'd like some time where I don't talk and just let my thoughts build together in my head. That was an honest statement. He had been given far too much to process and think about to truly know how he felt about any of it. Sure, Junko nodded. We'll go watch the raid. Follow me. As Cassis moved to follow the human, he wondered just how much he had changed since his capture. What ideas were already shifted around in his head. He wouldn't be the same. That much he knew for sure. But as he headed with her to listen and watch the raid unfold, he realized he wasn't sure who he wanted to win. The new Desvian commandos fighting alongside the humans, or the defenders who were true to the king. And that worried him.